formally adopt it in your employee handbook. Whereas if you just have it as a freestanding policy and make it very clear that this is going to expire when it expires,
Put an expiration on it.
It leaves you a little more flexible when it comes to the employee handbook not having to be run through your attorneys every few weeks.
So we've talked about that. So I know we're focusing on Florida, but a lot of our participants, your clients, my clients, may have employees that are in different states, maybe even different countries. Is there one area where the main office is located that supersedes the other? And because as you mentioned earlier, different states have different guidelines. I guess what supersedes what?
Right, and so that's what's been tough during this entire pandemic is you've got every level of government wanting to issue their respective fiats when it comes to how to best handle this pandemic. And it's created a lot of confusion. You've got the national government saying one thing, you might have a city saying another thing. Maybe you've got a county that thinks the city's crazy. Maybe the state thinks the county's crazy. And you got all these different conflicting directives in terms of what you should be doing to protect your workforce. And here in South Florida, as all of us know, you could be driving here in Fort Lauderdale and in a 5-minute span go through Lauderdale by the Sea, Oakland Park, Wilton Manors, Lauderhill, Fort Lauderdale. You could go through 5 different cities in the matter of just a few minutes, and they could all have their own reasoning as to what they think should be done to protect workforces, and it creates a lot of confusion. So what I've generally been telling my clients, and this is tough, is you got to start at the top, at the federal level, and determine what directives are coming down from DC that are binding on your organization, because generally speaking, federal law typically trumps state and local law. So you start there and you whittle your way down. Then you get to the state level, then you get to typically the county level, and from there, the city level. At the front end of this pandemic, again, you had every governmental entity you could imagine wanting to have a say, and that created a ton of confusion. And I think now, 15, 16 months into this, a lot of local governments at the city, county, and state level have decided, you know what, that period of time where we all had to have a say and thought it was our way or the highway didn't work. So thankfully, a lot of governments at the very local level and backing it up all the way to the state level have taken more of a hands-off approach recently. And you can see that in the form of the CDC's mask mandate that came out a few weeks ago. Here in Florida, for instance, the mask mandate was quickly pulled back after that CDC directive. You don't have many counties in Florida anymore implementing mask mandates. Here in South Florida, obviously, we've got some municipalities that are still trying to do that despite our governor saying that they can't. But yeah, it's very difficult, but you really have to do it on a microscopic level like that and really nail down, starting at the national level all the way down to the state level. And employers just have to be nimble. So for instance, employers here in Florida who have operations throughout the US are not going to be able to implement a national policy for their return to work strategy. They're going to have to be very flexible and explain to their employees, we may have one policy in Florida that's different than what we have in California, and that's different than what we have in New York. And that's just how it's going to be. It's not going to be easy, but that's the only way to do it right now as things stand.
Yeah, it's very valid. It's tough. It's tough. You have a lot of people you have to appease and a lot of people you have to answer to, especially for multinational or multi-state companies. So now we've talked a lot about, the vaccine, what you can't do employees. So Andrew, when one of your clients calls you and says, hey, yeah, I'm thinking about reopening, what do you tell them when the right time for returning employees to the workplace is?
Well, that's a tough question because I think I've used this phrase earlier, but there's just simply no one size fits all approach to reopening. Period, end of story. And as an example, you may have some businesses that are extremely labor intensive and that are tied to machines. And those jobs obviously can't be done unless you've got your employees in the office or on the floor or whatever the scenario is. And that may create an incentive for that employer to say, you know what, we got to get back to the office, period, end of story. we're going to implement whatever policies we need to make it happen. We can't keep losing business. We got to open back up. And that employer may take a different approach to opening up than, for instance, an accounting firm may take, because I think a lot of professionals in industries such as accounting have realized they can do their jobs remotely, and there's no rush to bring those accountants back to the office, because quite frankly, I've heard anecdotally, and I think there's some statistics to back this up, that there's a lot of professions, including accounting, that have found they can do their work remotely. And those professions are not in as big of a rush to get their employees back to the office, back on the floor, as you might have in different type of industries, such as the example I gave a minute ago. So there's really no one size fits all approach. And every business is going to have to look at its unique needs and see how it's been impacted from a financial standpoint and a productivity standpoint this last 15, 16 months, and make decisions from there. But I wish there was one size fits all approach to this, so that I could just type it up, send it out to all my clients and say, here it is. But there's just not. So every time I get a call from a client, we're putting together a custom approach to how best address their issues when it comes to returning to the office. And I have not seen, at least here in my client base in South Florida, I have not seen two approaches that have been the same. Every client of mine comes up with a unique approach that, again, is best suited for its needs and its employees. And I have not seen duplicative return to work policies whatsoever. And I don't anticipate that I will be seeing that either, because it's such a unique and personal process for each business.
So in regards to legally and doing things by the letter of the law, what are some best practices that you are seeing as people are reopening, and also best practices you're advising your clients when they're reopening?
Right. So obviously, first and foremost is complying with any national, state, or local directives as they relate to safety in the workplace associated with COVID-19. Period. End of story. You got to start there. But from there, what I am seeing and what I've been advising my clients to do is make sure that whatever return to work policies they put in place are clearly and concisely communicated to their employees, because this is basically the set of rules to the game you want your employees to play as they come back to the workforce. And without knowing what those rules are, your employees are going to have no clue what to do when they get there. And quite frankly, they're not going to have any faith that you've done what's necessary to protect their interest, which in this case is their health, and keeping them from being unnecessarily exposed to COVID-19. So any policy that you come up with that complies with these national, state, and local directives, to the extent they still exist, again, has to be clearly, concisely communicated to your employees. So communication is absolutely paramount when it comes to these return to work policies. And I'm seeing that most businesses, including my client base, are doing a good job getting out in front of that. They're not taking any short-sighted actions when it comes to returning to work. So for instance, I'm not hearing many stories of employers calling their employees at 4:30 on a Monday and saying, hey, guess what? We've decided to reopen the workplace. We expect you Tuesday. So that would be another thing to throw out there, just another tidbit is as employers are getting ready to comply with these national, state, and local directives and are putting their return to work policies together and clearly, concisely communicating them, they need to have a large amount of lag time between when the policy is developed and distributed to its employees and when it's actually going to be implemented. You don't want to do it on a Monday at 4:30 and implement it the following Tuesday at 8 a.m. You need to give employees a chance to adapt, because a lot of these employees for a year plus have gotten used to working remotely. And quite frankly, a lot of them don't want to go back to the workplace. So it's going to be a struggle, I suspect, for a lot of businesses to convince their employees to come back. And you're going to need some time to do that. So don't surprise your employees, even on a Friday afternoon, telling them the following Monday they're coming back. Give them some time to adjust and think about how they're going to comply with these new return to work plans that you're implementing. And that way you leave your HR team some time to deal with the inevitable fallout and pushback that I suspect there's going to be, and that I'm seeing both from my client base and from my team as we anticipate returning back to the office in the coming months.
No, that's a good point. So with you made some valid points. There are some professions, there are some, accountants, attorneys, insurance. A lot of us have figured out how to work from home, how to be productive. Some people aren't going to want to go back into the workforce. Some people commute for an hour. Some people, enjoy working from sweatpants. They don't, they've put on the COVID-19 and don't really feel like want to buy new dress pants. Those folks that do want to work from home, what are the legal ramifications of allowing employees to maybe work from home or maybe go to full-time work from home?
Right. So that's a good question. And quite frankly, it's one that has been asked of me quite a bit during this pandemic, and I've given it a lot of thought. And the way I like to talk about it is as follows. So typically you've got two types of employees. You've got hourly employees, who punch a clock. They get paid for their 40 hours a week. And when they're finished with their 40 hours, they're finished. Period. End of story. Then you've got salaried employees. Sometimes they work more than 40 hours a week. Sometimes they work less. Generally with salaried employees, they just work until they get the job done. If they're lucky, they do it in a lesser amount of time than 40 hours, and they still get paid as if they worked a full busy week. Sometimes it takes a lot more than that. So for salaried employees, I don't really have any issue with salaried employees staying on this working remotely structure that's been set up pretty nicely over the last 15 months, because they have to get the job done regardless of however many hours it takes. And you're not worried about watching their hours because they don't get paid hourly. They get paid the same regardless of how much time it gets them to do a job. Hourly employees, on the other hand, are the category of employees that do concern me a bit because, again, they're being paid hourly. And it's very tough to monitor how productive they are being with their time and whether, in fact, they are actually working during work hours, or if they might happen to be the kind of employee that is doing work off the clock. And when you've got an hourly employee who's working remotely, there really aren't a lot of mechanisms of oversight to make sure that employee is being productive during those 40 hours a week, or to make sure that that employee is not being asked to do things off the clock. Because if you've got an hourly employee who finishes up his or her workday at 5 o'clock, and their boss, who's a salaried employee, who's working late at night one night, and texts that hourly employee and says, "Hey, can you get me this? I'm still working," and that hourly employee does it and does it off the clock, it's technically compensable time. And because that hourly employee is doing it at home, there's really no way to monitor it. So I'm seeing a lot more situations like that where salaried employees are forgetting that hourly employees are still hourly employees and they need to work their 40 hours and that's it, and not be asked to do work off the clock. But also it's tough to monitor hourly employees' productivity because you can't just step outside your office and go down the hall and see what your hourly employees sitting there doing at their desk when they in fact are working remotely at their home. So I anticipate you'll see a lot more businesses pushing for their hourly employees to get back to the office before you see a big push of the salaried employees getting back there. Because again, the salaried employees have to do the job, period, end of story. And they get paid the same regardless of how many hours they work a week. Hourly employees are very different. And I think businesses are itching to get them back into a four-wall setting where their work productivity can be monitored a bit more, and their clocking in, clocking out habits and not working off the clock can also be monitored a bit more.
Very, very true. So I think we've covered most with employees. Now, I think most people have seen, we're in South Florida, we're in the midst of the cruise industry. We've seen a little bit of a impasse between the cruise industries and our governor. When it comes to guests and clients coming in the office, I guess, can you ask them if they are vaccinated? Can you make them sign an affidavit if they don't want to wear a mask? How does that work when you're having, clients and or guests in your office?
Right. So that's a great question. And it's one that's created a ton of confusion ever since Governor DeSantis signed that bill that bans what he calls vaccine passports. And what that means is basically the governor, through that piece of legislation, has said no business in Florida can require that one of its customers, and that's important because I'm talking about customers, not employees, and I'll make that distinction a little bit more clear in a minute. But that businesses in Florida cannot require its customers to present their vaccination card in order to receive goods or services from a business here in Florida. And that's true. So the cruise industry, as you know, has said, we know that law exists, but we think it would be best if we did have vaccine passports. And again, that phrase is a little misleading, but the cruise industry wants people to prove their vaccination status before they get on one of their ships. But again, like I said a minute ago, that only applies to a business's customers. That does not apply to a business's employees. So it was interesting because as that law was passed, I received a number of phone calls from clients saying, well, I guess now we can't ask about our employees' vaccination status because Governor DeSantis said, as a result of signing this bill, there's no vaccine passports allowed here in Florida, which is true, but only to a business's customers. So when a business has a customer come on site and the business might have some questions about whether or not that customer is in fact vaccinated for purposes of whether they should be required to wear a mask or not, assuming the business has a mask mandate, that business can't ask the customer any questions about their vaccination status, which is very interesting and frustrating for some businesses. But as it relates to the business's employees, they still have free reign to ask their employees whatever questions they need asked about vaccination status in order to keep their businesses safe. But it's really important to point out that distinction because there have been a number of businesses that have been confused by it and thought that the vaccination passport issue would preclude them from talking to their employees about vaccination status when in fact it does not.
Yeah, I'm sure your phone rang that day quite often. I'm sure you.
It sure did. It sure did.
Well, that's all my questions. I think we have some panelist questions, so I'm going to get to now. You've answered this one. Can employees ask for proof of vaccination, i.e. vaccination card? So absolutely. Andrew, I believe you said yes on that.
Yeah, so the answer to that is unequivocally yes. I would add, though, that when businesses are compiling this data, while in most situations this is not HIPAA-related data, it's not personal health information, it should nevertheless still be treated with the utmost respect and confidentiality. So when a business learns of someone's vaccination status, that information should be kept as confidential as possible. It should be stored in a safe, secure location, and again, treated with the utmost respect.
So the next question we have is, I thought DeSantis said if we require the vaccination, there's a $5,000 fine. I think you hit on that when you said there's a difference between the customer and an employee, and that $5,000 fine is more towards the customer.
Right. That would be specifically towards the customer, not to the employee. Period. End of story. I just want to be real clear. That fine only applies to customers. That law, in fact, entirely only applies to customers, not to employees. But it will be interesting to see how that plays out. As Logan alluded to, there is definitely a battle brewing between the cruise industry and Governor DeSantis on this issue, because the cruise industry, based on the demand of its customers who said they want vaccinations required of all cruisers, has said no one's getting on their ships unless they prove they're vaccinated. Most of these cruise lines are based here in Florida, and there's a law here in Florida that we've talked about that says you as a business can't in fact do that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the courts. I believe Governor DeSantis and the cruise industry were sent to mediation a few days ago. They weren't able to settle, so I suspect that means that issue will continue working its way through the courts, probably on an expedited basis as the cruise industries are trying to open it stop this summer. But it'll be interesting to see it play out.
Yeah, I was under the impression that cruising re-began January. I think it was July 15th. I had heard somewhere, so I was under the impression. Then, this weekend, all that came out, and it was very, very interesting for someone in South Florida who may want to go on a cruise sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it is interesting, and if you think back a few months ago, Governor DeSantis, whether you love him or hate him, was a pretty big advocate for the cruise industry, and the cruise industry was thanking him for all of his advocacy. Fast forward to him passing this no vaccine passport piece of legislation, and now the cruise industry just doesn't.
He's public enemy number one.
Yeah, he really is. He went from their hero to their villain very, very quickly.
All right, so the next question is, if we have a return to work policy and have an employee who would prefer not return to continue to work, doesn't feel safe, can we allow one employee not to return and require a different employee to return, say one that indicates childcare issues?
Right. So it's interesting. Unlike most attorneys, I've tried to be very, very direct and give extremely precise answers instead of answering generically. But it's probably important to throw out there that employers should remain as flexible as possible when they are implementing these return to work policies, because the implementation of these policies will create a lot of very touchy and difficult issues through which HR folks are going to have to work over these coming months. And the answer to that question is yes, you can definitely make business decisions about allowing a certain employee to continue working remotely while you do not do the same for another employee, so long as you're not doing it on the basis of some protected characteristic. For instance, if you decided, generally speaking, that you were going to allow all of the women in your office to continue working remotely because you believe, whether it's true or not, that women are going to be more likely providing childcare at home, and because of that, you don't want to interrupt their ability to do so. That's probably a pretty outdated presumption that I don't think we should be making in the year 2021. But if you made that presumption and implemented your policy in a way where women are benefiting as opposed to men who would be required to come back to the office, that means you're treating two different characteristics. Someone being male versus female, you're treating the females more favorably than the males, arguably, and that could be a form of discrimination. And the same is true for any protected characteristic. So you could implement your policy differently as needed, so long as it wasn't being done in a way that resulted in an outcome that would be discriminatory towards one group of individuals as opposed to another group.
Very valid points. Can the business ask the client customer to wear a mask?
Yes, so businesses still have the ability to implement safety measures above and beyond what are required at the state, county, local, and even national level. So if a business decides, similar to a no shirts, no shoes policy, that they want to continue mandating that masks be worn on their premises, they can do that. Same thing with their employees. If they want their employees to continue wearing masks for whatever reason they may have, they can do that. They should expect some potential blowback from that, particularly in light of some of the confusion about what businesses can and can't do, particularly in light of the CDC's recent guidance on mask wearing. But yeah, businesses still have the right to implement their own rules, and they could certainly continue requiring the wearing of masks at their business. But I would tell you that they probably will get, especially here in South Florida, a lot of pushback, in part because of the confusion I just referenced, but also because a lot of the big businesses down here, including the big box retailers, have basically stopped requiring masks be worn and are kind of going on the honor system of, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear it. If you are not vaccinated, you do, but there's generally not much policing happening down here anymore.
I agree with that. So I think that's all the questions. With, we've gone over a lot today. Obviously the last 15 or 16 months, most companies, most of your clients, most of my clients have been dealing with COVID. What else are you seeing in the employment law space that maybe is on the horizon, or some of your clients are dealing with or should be dealing with?
Well, I can tell you since March of last year, the number one issue I've been dealing with my clients is figuring out how to navigate this difficult time. We've been dealing with families first. We've been dealing with paycheck protection. We've been dealing with return to work. Every month, it seems like there's a new hurdle that we're all having to get over together. So it's been a very, very, very difficult year. Thankfully, all of my clients have made it through this difficult time, and some have come out even better than they were before. But in terms of what's on the horizon, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of issues relating to COVID-19. I don't think that is going anywhere anytime soon. There's a large number of employment law attorneys who are convinced that the next big wave will be whistleblower claims that occurred during this COVID-19 period, where, for instance, an employer was required to mandate masks in the workplace. They didn't mandate masks, an employee complained about it, and then that employer fired the employee. I don't know whether that'll turn out to be true or not, but it certainly makes a lot of sense logically. So I'm keeping an eye out for whether we'll see any whistleblower cases coming out of this COVID-19 period. And then I think the other big issue, and we talked about this earlier, are going to be wage and hour issues, because I think there are a lot of hourly employees who've been working remotely for the past almost year and a half, who probably have been doing work off the clock and probably have not been getting paid for it. And I suspect as employees start having more opportunities to make moves from one business to another, that they're going to think about whether or not they want to file a lawsuit against that previous employer that they're no longer associated with, who might not have paid them for that off the clock work that they did during the pandemic. So that's what I'm looking out for: whistleblower claims resulting from the pandemic and overtime lawsuits resulting from this working remotely paradigm that's been in place during the pandemic that we're slowly starting to come out of.
I never thought, it's a very valid point on the whistleblower, and, the hourly wage got me. I was actually thinking a lot. I think that's probably the biggest one personally, moving forward. I mean, think about the hourly people. Hey, can you do me a favor? I'm still doing this. They do it. Are we going to expect that when, we bring people back in the office, that we can text them at 8:00 at night if they're hourly and ask them, hey, can you just fix this for me?
Right. Yeah, it's difficult. Same thing with lunch breaks. Traditionally, when you're in an office and you're an hourly employee, you take a lunch break, you go downstairs, you get your lunch, you go to the break room. You're physically separated from your workspace and from your bosses. Doing it virtually, you're always tied to your computer. You're always tied to your phone. So that lunch break goes from a true hour break to one where your bosses still know where to find you. You're sitting at your house in your home office, and you're probably eating your lunch at the same desk where you're doing your work, and you're probably doing some work off the clock. So I've been telling my clients to keep an eye out for those issues and to mitigate them as much as possible. Same thing on the whistleblower front. But those are the two big things I think might be coming this year. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we will see.
We have one additional question. What is the criteria? Someone's asking, what is the criteria for determining a salaried versus hourly employee?
Right. So that's a very, very complicated question that I would certainly be willing to answer offline, but that's one that would take me at least 5 to 10 minutes to really go through. And because it's so precise in nature, I certainly don't want to do it right now, but I believe that was from Luana, and
I have Luana's contact info, so we can get that back to her. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk with you offline about that, Luana, but thanks for the question. And it is a very highly technical and important question because, quite frankly, I just wrote an article on misclassifying employees as salaried versus hourly, and it's something all businesses need to watch out for, because wage and hour claims are some of the most difficult to defend because, quite frankly, there aren't a lot of defenses. So it's a highly technical issue that I'd love to talk about more. But I don't want to go into too much detail right now, because that is one loaded question, but it's a very, very, very important.
It's probably another webinar.
That's probably another 10 webinars. Yeah, but I'd be happy to answer it offline.
No. Well, Andrew, thank you very much. All of our attendees, thank you very much for attending. I have recorded this, which I will get a copy over to Andrew, but if anybody would like it, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you very much. If either I can help you, anybody out here with their insurance and their employee benefits, please reach out to me. If Andrew can help you out with your employment law, you've heard the man talk. He knows his stuff. So definitely feel free to reach out for him. And we thank you. And if we ever do another one of these together, which I hope we do, we'll certainly invite you all.
Thanks, Logan. This was great. And thanks to all of our participants today. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to Logan and myself talk a little bit. Thanks again, Logan.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Have a great one. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye.